that's fine.
I said, I haven't seen who's all here yet.
That's all right. Make sure we're online. Camera's up, recording.
I don't see myself.
You got your video turned off?
There.
Lower left corner.
This one?
It'll be lower left.
A little dot down.
Didn't touch any
Hover
buttons.
over the video, or the left-hand corner.
No, I don't.
Where the unmute is, next to the mute button.
Okay, Paul, click on yours. Okay. Apparently you gotta scroll up a little bit in this corner. It'll say video will be on or off.
Screen. I love it.
Oh, you love it.
All right, thank you, ma'am.
I think we've had several meetings like this.
Is there anybody that we need to be concerned about here? I think we have everybody who want to roll call.
Roll call or call to order?
Start the meeting, I guess. We have a agenda.
Yes. Once you're all seated and everybody's set.
And you'll have a
Seated, then we'll
stand up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say, I'm not sure if this is an ideal meeting for talking about parking on your front lawns, though.
Okay.
So if we can kick that there.
Call the meeting of June 11th to order of the Cedar Springs City Council at 7:16 due to power failure. If you would all rise with me and recite the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. My mic sticks. Folks would like to unmute the microphone. Okay. All right, at this time, I have a roll call vote. Miss Atchison.
Here.
Miss Conley. Mr. Gross.
Here.
Mrs. Nixon.
Here.
Miss Powell.
Here.
Mrs. Race.
Here.
Mayor Hall is here. Due to some time with communication and when we call for a roll vote, if your audio isn't on, give a thumbs up for yes and a thumbs down for no. So, public comment. The council welcomes and encourages the public to speak during the public comment of the public hearing portion of the agenda. However, council's policy is to hear the public comment, not to act on the public comment at this time. Concerns brought before the council during the public comment portion of the agenda will be referred to the city manager for action. If, after communication with the city manager, no resolution is reached, the concerns will be elevated to the mayor and eventually to the council for action. Those citizens wish to speak on agenda or non-agenda items will be allowed a maximum of 4 minutes each to address their concerns. This is the only time during the council meeting that citizens are allowed to address the council. Please state your name and address for the record if you would like. Mrs. Johnson, is there anyone online wishing to speak?
There are 2 members of the public present. I will call on Bryn first. Bryn, if you have a public comment, please make your comment at this time. If you do not have a public comment, you can say yes.
Would like to make a comment. It's in regards to the Marijuana Zoning Act you guys are going to possibly be voting on tonight. I do have a business in the B2 district surrounded by B3 district.
Thank you.
And one more person, if this person would like to make a comment, then go ahead and unmute this time. Christina? If you have a public comment, you can make it at this time. If not, it's the cast.
I'm simply here because Rise Up Church has an event on the agenda, and it's a good opportunity for me to see how the city council works. If that time anybody has a question for me about that, I will be here. So thank you.
And then one more member of the public just joined us as well. Looks like Copper Moore. If you have a public comment for anything on the agenda or not on the agenda, you may make your public comment at this time. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. If you have a public comment, you can make it on, or you may say pass.
I have no comment.
So no comment, Copper? Or Cooper?
Yeah, no comment.
Okay, thank you. There are no other members of the public online. Are there any members of the public at City Hall?
We do
No.
have two members of the public here at City Hall. Would either of them like to make a comment? Seeing no, thank you.
Okay, moving on then to item 4, public hearing. Mr. Womack, we have any this evening?
No, we do not have any public hearings at this time.
Thank you. The next item is item 5, adoption of the agenda. Is there any changes or alterations or that we need to do, or any council member wishes to change?
Mr. Hall, I did send an email out to the council regarding this issue earlier this week, and that is the governor's executive order, which allows virtual meetings, is set to expire on June 30. I understand we do have several members of the city council that prefer to attend virtually. However, it's my understanding of the Open Meeting Act that past the executive order expiring on June 30, that city council members would not be able to attend meetings virtually anymore. However, I think we would be on solid legal ground that if this body wanted to make a motion to allow any council member to attend a meeting virtually and partake in discussion only virtually, I think that would be acceptable. But they would not be able to participate in voting virtually. So it's up to council if they want to pursue that. I would review the Open Meetings Act more thoroughly to ensure that that is a legal thing to do. But I'll leave it to council if they want to add that as a discussion item or action item.
Thank you. Any questions or concerns of the council? What's the will of the council?
I would like to see it go to a discussion. That way we could ask a couple questions without
Sure.
lingering on it too long at this point in time.
Would be C.
Mr. Mayor, would you remind the members of City Council if they're going to make any comment to unmute their worksheets, just so everyone can hear?
Rebecca, I've tried and I cannot unmute, I cannot change the mute on my screen.
Oh, wants to talk.
Not really.
Second on adding that as a discussion, or can we
Push
just
that?
add it?
I did. Oh, with the mouse. Okay. All right, thank you.
I believe you need a second. It's a motion to
Yep. Is there a second to that motion to move it to discussion? Ms. Atkinson did. Okay, we haven't approved the agenda yet, so we can add or subtract
be
it.
muted.
Okay.
Okay, right now, the way it's written, the agenda, we will be adding that discussion on meeting attendance in the discussion portion in item 8. At that time, we can decide whether a motion or to discuss only. Is there any other adoptions or changes to the agenda at this time? I would entertain a motion to adopt the agenda.
I would make a motion to adopt the agenda as amended.
Second?
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to adopt the agenda as changed. Your roll call vote. Ms. Atchison.
Yes.
Ms. Conley.
Yes.
Mr. Gross.
Yes.
Ms. Nixon.
Yes.
Ms. Powell.
Yes.
Ms. Race.
Yes.
Ms. Hall votes yes. Adoption of the agenda. Next, item 6, consent agenda. Has everyone looked that over? Any questions, concerns of our finance director at this time? Will of the council. I would entertain a motion to approve.
I'll make the motion, I gotta do this. I'll make a motion to approve the approval of the consent agenda.
I would second.
It has been moved and seconded. Any further discussion on the consent agenda?
I have one comment.
Mr. Gross.
I vote no. That does not mean I'm voting no on all of it. I think we've discussed most of it enough. It may be just a belief that I don't believe in a couple of the items.
Thank you. Okay, any other concerns before I call the vote? Ms. Atchison.
Yes.
Ms. Conley.
Yes.
Mr. Gross.
No.
Ms. Nixon.
Yes.
Ms. Powell.
Yes.
Mrs. Race.
Yes.
Mr. Hall votes yes. Motion carries. Moving on to action items. Mr. Romax, item A.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Item A is motion to approve the presented budget amendments for the 1920 budget. This is standard operating procedure. It's simply taking the different funds and kind of moving money around within each fund. Sometimes we miss the mark low, sometimes we miss the mark high. There was nothing in there that was especially concerning. It's just a normal procedure. And the finance director, I believe, is on if you have any questions for her.
Thank you. What's the will of the council?
I'd like to make,
Mayor, I make a motion to approve the budget.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded.
I'll second that.
Thank you. Any discussion before I call the roll? This is this year's budget from 2019 to 2020 budget. Any questions of the finance director, Ms. Falcon?
I'd only point out that this is budget amendments, the 1920 budget, not any new budget.
Correct.
I will clarify my motion to approve the presented budget amendments for the 2019-2020 budget.
And I'll second it again.
Okay, Mrs. Johnson, did you get that?
I got that. Ms. Howell, did you also second that amendment?
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am.
Okay.
Just take the leg.
Any other questions or concerns before I call the vote? Hearing none. Mrs. Atchison.
Yes.
Mrs. Conley.
Yes.
Mr. Gross.
Yes.
Ms. Nixon.
Yes.
Ms. Powell.
Yes.
Ms. Race.
Yes.
Mr. Hall votes yes, the motion carries. Moving on to item B, Mr. Romax. Uh-oh.
So my apologies, and we are having some delays, so it's coming across a little comical. I did have the marijuana regulatory ordinance brought up, but when I lost internet, it disappeared off my screen. So you just have to give me one additional second here. Bring it up on the website. So while it's loading, I will tell you that I did make one minor change to it. It's something that we had talked about previously. And after talking about it with the city attorney, I felt more confident with adding this section. And you will see it highlighted in yellow at the bottom of page 26 of the packet. And it's something that I think all marijuana businesses are going to do of their own accord anyways. But I do sometimes feel like we have to legislate for the lowest common denominator. And fresh in my mind is the gun robbery that we had here in the city a year or two ago. And I think it's appropriate to add this section to prevent any kind of smash and grab type robbery that might occur at marijuana businesses. The additional section simply requires that all usable marijuana that is not currently being grown be removed from public areas and be secured in a secure room, a secure vault, or a container of some sort, usually a gun safe of some kind.
Yep.
So it's not a major change, and other than that, the rest of the ordinance remains the same as you've seen it the last several times.
Isn't it by state law they're required to do that anyway?
You know, I've been reading the ordinances
Doing.
and regulatory stuff for almost 2 years now.
Yes.
It's so complicated sometimes, I'm not 100% sure exactly what it requires, which is one of the reasons I want it in our ordinance.
Yep.
Because
Makes sense.
I suspect that it's required in the state law, but if not, it's certainly required under ours.
Thank you. What's the will of the council on this ordinance?
I'll make a motion to approve the Cedar Springs recreational marijuana regulatory ordinance.
Second?
Ms. Conley, you second it? Yes, Ms. Conley seconded. Any discussion? I know we've talked this thing for the last 2 years, so any discussion from anyone before we call the vote?
I guess I stand on one thing. This is what the people voted for, and this is what we're trying to proceed with. Not only Cedar Springs, but our surrounding townships voted to approve this type of marijuana sales, and the people of the state of Michigan also did. So I wouldn't feel right to go against it.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments before I call the vote? Hearing none?
Mr. Mayor, I would just add one thing, and that's in support of what Councilor Powell just indicated. You know, I've stated it before and I'll state it again, the votes of the council members don't necessarily reflect their own personal feelings about this.
No.
But the city of Cedar Springs voted, I believe, 59% in favor of legalizing recreational marijuana in the city. Those are hard numbers to fight against. And I think that this council, regardless of their personal feelings, put a lot of hard work in fashioning a law that I think overall reflects what the voters wanted.
Okay. Any comments? This is the last chance. I'm going to call the vote. Here we go. Mrs. Race.
Yes.
Ms. Atchison,
Yes.
Ms.
Yes.
Ms. Powell,
Yes.
Ms. Conley, Ms. Nixon,
Yes.
Mr. Gross,
No.
Mr. Hall, yes. Motion carries. Moving on to item C.
Mr. Hall, could you clarify for me Mr. Gross's vote?
No,
No?
correct.
No was the vote. Yes, he can clarify that for me. Sorry.
We all set? Mrs. Johnson? Ms. Johnson, you all set with that?
Yep, just a reminder, if you guys are not speaking, please just
Okay,
keep your microphones muted. That's why we're getting some of that feedback. So if you're not speaking, just make sure you're muted. If you are speaking, make sure you unmute yourself before you start talking.
thank you. Okay, moving on to item C, Mr. Womack.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So similarly, there's only been one very minor change to the zoning ordinance since you last saw it, and that is at the bottom of page 38 of your packet, under micro business. It was my understanding, based on the recommendation of the Planning Commission, that the City Council has changed their thoughts regarding separation distance between micro businesses in the I-1 zoning district and any property zoned as R1, R2, or mixed use, increasing the distance from 100 feet to 500 feet, effectively removing the ability to place a micro business in the industrial section of town downtown at all. Other than that, I don't believe there are any other changes proposed in this that were not already agreed to by council.
Thank you. What's the will of the council?
I'd like to make a motion to approve Cedar Springs recreational marijuana zoning ordinance. And I forgot to.
Second.
Been moved and seconded to approve motion to approve the Cedar Springs recreational marijuana zoning ordinance. Any questions? Hearing none. I'll do a roll call vote. Mr. Hall, yes. Mrs. Race,
Yes.
Mrs. Powell,
Yes.
Mrs. Nixon,
Yes.
Mr. Gross,
No.
Mrs. Conley, Ms. Atchison.
Yes.
Motion carries. Ms. Johnson, did you get that? Good, thumbs up.
Got that loud and clear. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Item D. Moving on to item D. Mr. Womack.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The city was approached by a citizen who owns the property located at 125 Linda Street. We didn't have a ton of time to prepare because this only got to us a day or two before the last Planning Commission meeting. The Planning Commission did review it briefly, and they did make a recommendation at that time to the City Council to accept that land donation. Of course, the issue for me at this point is, I'm not entirely clear on what requirements that the property owner may wish to impose on his donation of that property. There was discussion about naming rights of any park that might be created by that. I don't like to place that type of limitation on the City Council. I know the City Council likes to name its parks. And there are some alternatives that we could maybe offer the property owner. For example, you could let him name the property for, the park for a number of years. Or the City Council could allow him to put a dedication on a bench, however he wishes, but not to name the park itself. There's also an issue of taxes. So that property does cost $350 approximately in summer taxes and $12 in winter taxes. And while the city would not have to pay that once the property were ours, the owner of the property right now believes it's appropriate for the city to take on and pay those taxes that are due and owing right now on his behalf. There's also transfer costs that would be involved. I'd have to have the city attorney draft some documents, which would be minimal, but there are costs. The development costs of a park would be the substantial part of this. The proper reason for the donation of the property is for the development of a playground park. And I have recommended perhaps as an option a community garden. Now, it is obscene how much play equipment costs for playgrounds. And the city simply doesn't have it in the budget to put a full-blown playground in at that location at this time. A community garden would be a lot cheaper and easier to do, I think, at this time. And we could continue as a community garden ad infinitum. We could make it a community garden with some playground equipment to be a community park. And we also have to look at such things as installation of water. Currently, there is no water available at the site. We'd probably also want to include some kind of parking location on site. So there are some things that need to be addressed in this acceptance of property. And I guess I'd recommend at this time the city council discuss each of those or any other things that it sees fit, and perhaps appoint somebody to lead a negotiation with the property owner with, I guess, authority to accept that if the negotiator is able to come to appropriate terms with the property owner.
Okay, I'm familiar with that lot. The city currently has a water main that runs down the south side of that lot from our number 3 well house. It runs out to Linda Street. I was at the planning commission when Mr. Brennan, I think his name was, is a donating owner. He would like to see it as a park, whether we take it in and just have it as a park for the local kids to play, pick up baseball or whatever for now, or do we name it? And my big concern is the property taxes. We've had that problem in the past where we are paying property tax. So I would be very cautious that we would take the property and then end up having to pay property taxes on that like we do on some of our other parcels.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I think if we were to take the property and immediately name it as a park or community garden for the public benefit,
Correct.
It would thereafter be tax exempt. Part of the reason that we pay property taxes on some of the city's properties is that they are not currently being used specifically for the public interest. For example, the property that the RC airplane guys have their runway set up, the assessor has viewed that as a private use of public property. And anytime that happens, we lose our tax exempt status.
Yes.
Now, the property taxes on that piece of property are also minimal, and we are developing it, so it will eventually be sold off to private interests, so we'll no longer have to pay those property taxes either. But what I'm just talking about here is simply that right now, the property owes $350 that the property owner has asked that the city pay on his behalf. Of course, we'd be essentially paying it to ourselves, but he doesn't want to pay the property taxes, which is a reasonable request, but it's something we would have to pay.
Do you have a reasonable number of what it would cost for transfer fees and in particular the $350 plus cost to get it brought into the city?
I don't. It can't be that much. This is not a terribly complicated situation. We
Okay.
simply have to have, a transfer recorded at county. Probably a couple $100 on
We're talking approximately $500 to bring it into the city. Correct?
Yeah, but of course, there are also benefits to taking on the property, which I think $500 pales in comparison to. And that is partially that we do have a water line there, and we don't want a house being built anywhere near our water line. So if that water line were to burst or have any problems, it's to our benefit not to have a house, anywhere near it, to enable us to fix it. As I also understand that currently this plot of land is already used by the youth of that neighborhood as a park.
Correct.
So it is to the public benefit to have a park in that location.
At the planning commission, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Womack, the owner at that time wasn't really concerned about the naming of it, or if we put a bench on it. He just would like to donate it to the city. And then if we did decide to name it, just one of the names to put in the hat was his wife's. And if we so wished, we could put a bench there with a plaque on it of the family name. That was the only thing, and from what I understand, that was not a deal breaker if we didn't.
Yeah, and so that's one of the reasons that my recommendation would be for the council to authorize approving this, and then designate somebody to negotiate the transfer with the owner. One of the unfortunate side effects, as you guys all know, of COVID-19 and virtual meetings is that sometimes it's difficult to get to the core of a matter, which is much easier done in person or perhaps on the telephone. So I would ask that the city council authorize the mayor and the city manager to pursue that, and authorize, I guess, a reasonable amount of money to effectuate that transfer.
What's the will of the council?
Do we, since this is the first time it's come before council, should we table this for another month since there's so many questions and unanswered variables with this situation?
That's an entirely reasonable thing to do. The only problem with that, of course, is that this piece of property is on the real estate market for sale. And it is theoretically possible that somebody else could come in and purchase it with other intentions. Now, that being said, with the water pipe that goes along the side of the property, which has an easement over it, and the sheer depth of the sewer line there, which is, I think, 20 or 25 feet deep.
About 30.
I suspect that this property is probably unbuildable, at least not buildable for somebody who's trying to turn a profit on it. So I believe it would probably be available again in a month's time, so I have no objections to it being tabled. But of course, time could be of the essence.
I do have one further question.
Go ahead, Mrs. Dixon.
Was it the stipulation of the current property owner that we do put playground equipment on it?
I believe the intention of the property owner was that it was developed into a park or playground at some point. I don't know, and I certainly would be opposed to any time stipulations for when that might occur, only because I've been trying to scrimp and save to put money into other playgrounds and other things that we're doing in the city. We just simply do not have $100,000, $200,000 to put in play equipment for this particular lot. I have talked to at least one homeowner in that area who said that a community garden would be welcome there. And I think similar to what I proposed at the heart of Cedar Springs, that there could be a natural type playground installed at very low costs that children would love to play on. It just wouldn't be glitzy and glamorous and full of plastic.
Okay.
What's the will of the council on this issue? We table it or make a motion to approve?
I would like to make a motion to authorize the city manager and city mayor to further negotiate the transfer of this property from this donor to the city.
ask a question? Is that a sense of tabling it, or you want them to take action on it
To accept,
if they find that it's acceptable? Sorry, I forgot to unmute.
So the question was if I wanted them to just investigate, or if I wanted them to take action if they found the terms acceptable. My intent of that motion was to ask them to take action if they found the terms acceptable.
who
I don't-
seconded
You didn't
that?
unmute.
That was seconded by Lisa Atchison.
Okay, it was been moved and seconded to approved of the land donations of 125 South Linda Street for the park upon terms acceptable. Mrs. Johnson, do you have that? How Mrs. Nixon
I
wants?
did not catch that, unfortunately. Could you please repeat it?
Could you repeat your motion,
Yes.
please?
So the motion was to allow the city manager and the mayor to accept this donation upon terms that they found acceptable for the city.
Mrs. Atchison, do you agree with that?
Yes, I second.
Mrs. Action agreed with that motion. Any further discussion? Hearing none.
If I could.
Mr. Gross.
At the last meeting, we had a gentleman that was arguing, and it muted on itself here, just a minute.
You should be good.
Anyway, we'll try it.
You're on.
The gentleman came in and was upset because we were developing a park that was already existent in a manner that we felt was a good use. Do we know how the feelings are of the majority of the people that live in that area as to having a park in there, additional traffic, and parking spaces for people to park in that are going to use the park? And I think that probably should be something that is researched also. Otherwise, we have some resentful people because we've created more traffic, more kids, things of that nature in there. That's my question or comment.
Thank you.
To answer that question and comment, I have spoken extensively with one of the immediate next door neighbors. And I understand that the other immediate next door neighbor rents the property, but I've not had the opportunity to speak with them. But as I understand it, it's something that will be welcomed by the neighborhood. Obviously, I haven't polled everybody, I haven't talked to everybody, but that's my general understanding. But, you know, this could be one of those things that the mayor and I work it out, and if we don't feel like we have come to an appropriate conclusion at that time, then we can bring it back to the city council at the next meeting.
That's fine. I just think that's one of the parts of the process that should be taken to make sure that the entirety and not one or two that are acceptable to it, because it will affect other people around the blocks based on the traffic.
Okay, so it's probably an appropriate step then for the city to advertise a little bit more widely and see if there's more neighborhood feedback. But in the meanwhile, I think it's still acceptable for the mayor and I to at least speak with the property owner and see if we can come to terms.
I'm not disagreeing about that point. I just don't want us to step in, take over some property that people are going to be upset with what we're trying to develop there afterwards.
I think realistically, that property will probably be a green strip for a lot of years.
And that could be.
And that may probably be its outcome. Name it as a park or whatever, but realistically, it'll probably be a grass field for the local kids to play ball. Or maybe a small patch for a garden. But the monies and the funds, we have other places for them, so to allocate money to build a playground there, I think it'll be a while, and I surely probably won't be in this, on this council, and most of us here were either, before the funds are available. So,
I would tend to agree to you, or with you, but the case is, we aren't talking about keeping it just for the neighborhood kids. We're opening it up as a part for the community. And with that, I'll rest what I have to say.
Should we send out the letters like we did for the dog park, or, because it's the zone or whatever?
And so that's similar to what I was just proposing to Councilor Gross, is that in the meanwhile, the mayor and I can make contact with the property owner, we can start negotiating out terms, and while you've authorized us, at least this motion has, authorized the city manager and the mayor to proceed, you guys know that it is my strong belief that I get council approval for any major decisions that are made. So I will attempt to proceed with getting more input from the community. And if I don't feel comfortable proceeding at that point, I won't. Of course, the mayor and I talk on a daily basis, and I believe that the mayor has a good sense of the pulse of both the community and the city council. And of course, I try to keep you guys as informed as I can as well. So I guess that's what I'm asking is, I would ask you to approve the motion that's on the table, and I will then proceed to make more inroads towards communicating with members of the public in that area.
any other questions? Okay.
Comment?
Okay,
Only that is what I was looking for, is just making that part of the decision-making process to get a determination on what's going to be acceptable. That's it. I do believe you should be looking into it.
we would do that anyway. Any others? Any other discussion, questions? Hearing and seeing none, I'll have a roll call vote. Mrs. Atchison?
Yes.
Mrs. Conley? Do we have Mrs. Conley?
She did thumbs up.
Okay, Mrs. Conley, give a thumbs up. Excuse me, Mr. Gross.
Yes.
Mrs. Nixon.
Yes. Oh, wait.
Mrs. Powell.
Yes.
Mrs. Race.
Yes.
Mr. Hall votes yes. Majority all yes. Mrs. Johnson? Okay. Moving on to item E. Mr. Womack.
So first of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Heisinger for being with us today. Ms. Johnson, if you could unmute Mr. Heisinger so he could have some input if the council has any questions for him. So this originally came to me as a community event application. Of course, as council's aware, authority was given to administration to approve of events at the amphitheater if they met certain guidelines and requirements. And so I've been back and forth with Mr. Heisinger about various aspects of what he's proposed out there. And I think at the end of the day, a community event application is the appropriate way to go about it. You'll see that subpart A under E is that we have an ordinance that prohibits amplified music prior to 11:30 a.m. any day of the week.
Correct.
I believe that while we were in discussions regarding the amphitheater, I guess we didn't anticipate, we probably should have, but we didn't anticipate that members of the public, groups, would like to use that amphitheater with amplified music prior to 11:30 a.m., whereas we did include prohibitions past, I believe it's 10 p.m. At the nighttime. So, we did have some parking discussions. I believe we have those all resolved. I made the recommendations that you see in the community event application itself. So at this point, the only thing I need council to weigh in on really is this amplified music prior to 11:30 a.m. Of course, it's council's prerogative to discuss anything in the community event that you see.
Okay. Mr. Heisinger, you wish to speak?
Well, if it's helpful,
Mr. Heisinger, is it possible, because of the acoustics of the new amphitheater, is it possible for your June 21st meeting to try it without amplification? And then if it doesn't work out, come back with the July 19th and the August 16th with a request for amplified music?
I'm not answering quickly because I'm trying to think it through.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
We're intending to have a FM transmitter so that those folks
Oh, I see.
who feel like they want to keep, especially a safe distance, some of those could park with the view of the amphitheater and listen on their
I see.
harmonies. So in order to do that, we have to have a feed coming from our sound board that will enable them to hear on our radio.
Mr. Heisinger, would it also be a fair statement that your service utilizes music as part of the service?
Yes, it would.
Okay.
So you'd lose something if you didn't have your music?
Yeah, it would definitely, that would be a difficult to not have music. We, but just to be clear, we're not planning a concert, and I think we're planning to sing 3 songs.
Mr. Heisinger, the reason I asked that question was the architect that designed that said the acoustics were good enough to hear a guitar, regular guitar, 2 city blocks, and that's why I asked. But if you're using transmitting over your receiver, then I would withdraw that.
Well, Mr. Hall, if I could, if council will recall, especially those who live within earshot of this amphitheater, we did have a couple of concerts there last year, which were exceedingly loud.
Yes.
And this might be a good opportunity for us to kind of measure and gauge what would be an appropriate sound level for future concerts. Because I hate to admit it, but a large part of the drafting of that set of policies and guidelines was simply based on what others have done. And I don't know what would work for our community until we physically get out there and listen to it. So in light of the fact that Mr. Heisinger has indicated, which it wasn't written down, and I should have asked for this, that the music won't start until 10 o'clock, which is certainly not 7:30 in the morning. I think it's probably appropriate. We would ask him to make sure that the music was not incredibly loud, to set it at an appropriate level, and that we'll have a city representative, namely me, out there to gauge it, see how things go, and if things are inappropriately loud, we'll address it at that time.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Could there not be like a sound check before the thing starts to see how loud it is?
Could there not be like a sound check?
So then they could gauge how loud it really needs to be.
Mr. Womack would be there to do that.
Mr. Heisinger?
So then they could gauge.
Mr. Heisinger, the question is, sorry, there's significant delay. Mr. Heisinger, the question is whether you'll have somebody gauging the sound to keep it at an appropriate level.
We normally have some practice time before, so, that 10 would be making some practice kind of noise prior to the beginning time. And, if Mr. Womack is going to be there, we certainly could consult
on that note, I would make the motion to approve of the Rise Up Church community event application for June 21st, July 19th, and August 16th.
I'll second that.
Mrs. Race?
The only thing, sorry, Mr. Hall, the only thing I would ask is that parking was part of the discussion on this event. We don't want people parked nose in towards the White Pine Trail.
Correct.
And also, Mr. Heisinger did not indicate a new parking lot on his plans.
Yeah.
So obviously, we'd ask that they use that lot. And we've also, as you guys know, put up a rope barrier along the northern edge of Maple Street.
Right.
And we dedicate that as parallel parking, because if you were to nose in park there, you'd block a travel lane. And then there's also the parking spots on the west side of the fire station. I've smoothed it over with the fire chief, who's indicated that he would allow those spots to be used.
I read your letter.
But obviously, we want to keep some spots available for the fire people. But just the parking was an issue, and I'd like to, I guess, have authority to keep some of those clear and make sure the rules are followed.
Thank you. Any questions or other concerns about this community event application?
I think it'd be interesting to find out how
Absolutely.
well
It works.
that amplification of the actual amphitheater would work without the electrified amplification, just to try it and see what it's like. I don't think anybody's done that yet.
They haven't.
Well,
But
Councilor Powell, I have a tambourine in my office. We can go out there after the meeting if you'd like.
no.
Nice.
See, they would like to hook up a little amplification for their AM and FM transmitter for the people in their car and their iPad, so that's why they would use it.
Broadcasting.
It'll be minimal.
They still might be able to hear it.
Correct.
It would be just, just a test run.
Absolutely. Any other further discussion on the motion? Hearing none. Mrs. Atchison?
Yes.
Mrs. Conley? I heard a yes, I think. Mr. Groves?
Yes.
Mrs. Nixon?
Yes.
Mrs. Powell?
Yes.
Mrs. Race?
Yes.
Mr. Hall votes yes, the motion carries. I heard a yeah. Ms. Johnson, did you get that?
Is that 7-0, all of them were yes?
Yes, correct. Moving on to F. Mr. Womack.
So, as everybody's aware, our restaurants and bars have been closed for the better part of 2 months. And the state legislature is working on various things that might assist them. One of which is, well, I'm not sure if this comes from the state legislature, but it's something that I've spoken with several restaurants about here locally, and that is due to the 50% capacity requirement, that some of them would like to expand outside of their buildings, outdoors. So, one of the problems we have is right now, section 40465 does authorize outdoor dining areas, but it does have certain requirements. I am asking the council to authorize me to temporarily suspend section 4465, I guess, in my best abilities, so that these restaurants can expand outdoors. Now, I think that 4465 is appropriate, and I think it's 7 and 8. Let's see if I can pull it up here real quick. Yep, so 7 and 8 I think are appropriate, but it is number 8 that is a problem. I don't anticipate all of these restaurants are going to want to continue outdoor dining indefinitely into the future. And I don't want to force restaurants to spend their hard-earned cash on tubular aluminum with wrought iron appearance or other suitable materials. I I think I would like to approve of more temporary type fencing. Certainly, I think it's appropriate to delineate the dining area away from the general outdoors, but I don't want to require wrought iron or aluminum.
Right.
So I would ask for the council to temporarily, I guess, authorize the city manager to suspend 40-465 or parts thereof in order to enable the restaurants in town to have some outdoor dining.
Okay. What's the will of the council?
Mr. Mayor, I will make a motion to temporarily suspend section 40-465, accessory outdoor dining areas. To authorize the city manager to develop temporary outdoor dining ordinance rules until October 31st, 2020, in order to facilitate compliance with EO 2020-91.
I would second.
It's been moved and seconded to authorize the temporary suspension of section 2465. Any further discussions or concerns?
I'm just trying to figure out what restaurants and where are these gonna be on the sidewalk or the side of the building, or where are they gonna be?
It can't be on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
So, the two that I'm aware of would be the Cedar Springs Brewing Company, and my understanding is that they'd like to expand into their own back parking lot area, essentially lengthening or increasing the size of a beer garden that already exists. And then the second one would be Classic Kelly's. I did speak with the owner about two potential locations. There is, I believe, a side entrance door which he could eliminate a couple parking spots and set up some high tops in that
Yep.
location. But also back behind the building, there is some area which would be acceptable. The only problem there is now they'd be exiting, I believe, off the kitchen door instead of a side, door. But I think they can make it work.
Okay, any other questions? I'll call for a vote. Ms. Atchison?
Yeah.
Mrs. Conley? Mrs. Conley? Ms. Conley votes yes. Mr. Groves?
Yes.
Mrs. Nixon?
Yes.
Mrs. Powell?
Yes.
Mrs. Raith?
Yes.
Mr. Hall votes yes. Motion carries. Any other business to be brought before this, Mr. Womack? Before we move
No
into
other
discussion.
action items at this time, thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to discussion item, discussion on parking on front lawns.
So, I know this is not a popular thing to discuss, and I think we're gonna be discussing it for some time before we come up with any kind of real solution. But I do believe council needs to be aware that this is an issue at the very least today. Currently, the city code enforcement officer and myself are stuck between a rock and a hard place. When you look back at the ordinances that have passed, and the controversies that have existed, and just the unfortunate, effects of zoning throughout the years, currently, we do not allow any vehicles to be parked on the front lawn of any business or residential home in the city. That's just not permitted under our ordinances. However, if you drive down the street, you will see that many people do in fact park on their front lawns. We also have the problem of, I believe back in 2014, a law was passed that allows individuals to park on what is referred to as, I believe, the boulevard, which would be the area between the paved road surface and the sidewalk, if there is a sidewalk, or the end of the road right-of-way, effectively the area perpendicular to the street. But it only allows that if that area is paved over with asphalt or concrete. and virtually nobody in the city has done that. So amongst other problems, but those are the two main ones, that the city code enforcement officer is stuck trying to convince people that they are violating the law, because they are in fact violating the law, but not wanting to cite half the city with municipal infractions, because I'd rather not be shish kebab on the front lawn of City Hall. So, there is a solution in here somewhere, if council wants it. Now, I understand that this is a farming community, and we are on the northern edge of Grand Rapids. But if you look to places like Rockford and Greenville and Sparta, they also do not allow parking on the front lawn. Now, Sand Lake, I believe, allows it, and I believe the townships allow it, but no other city or village in the immediate vicinity allows it. So, I guess at this point, I would ask the city council whether this is something they even want to consider discussing into the future. But as far as action, I'd recommend that we kick this to the planning commission and allow them to do some work, and possibly come up with a solution or recommendation.
I think that it should be passed back to the planning commission. It was one of their ordinances that they put together, and I remember years ago there was a lot of discussion on this back and forth. So that's my opinion. The rest of the council, it's up to you folks, whatever you'd like to weigh in at.
I would agree with the mayor's comments. It should go back to the planning commission to be taken a look at.
Correct.
If it's on the books, it should be enforced. If it's not going to be enforced, then it should be taken off the books.
Correct. I think the following, item B also, for corner lot fencing, should be thrown back to the planning commission also. You know, it's their ordinances that they've asked us to adopt, so I think they should be the ones to modify, change, or eliminate.
Did you want to address these both at the same time, or let the rest of the board
Let's do
have a
the-
comment on the parking first?
On the parking on the front lawn, I think I seen Mrs. Race nod yes to send it to planning. Mrs. Nixon, your thoughts?
I would say send it back to planning commission. I need some more solid definitions on what they consider a front lawn.
Yes.
Most of our homes in this community were built with only enough parking spaces for one vehicle, and that has not been our reality since the 80s. So we need to figure out a way to make those things fit.
Thank you. Ms. Powell?
I'd like to see it go to the planning commission first too.
It's kind of unanimous. Mrs. Conley, you agree that it should go back to planning?
Not the COVID.
Hearing no comment, so I guess I would recommend that we send it back to the planning commission, Mr. Womack. Oh, I forgot, Miss Ashton, you're not on your,
Yeah,
you're not,
I agree also, but I was also on the planning commission.
pardon?
I was on the commission when this happened,
Yes,
and I know there's a lot of
yes,
reasons why people had to park, but there were also people parking without reasons, so.
correct. All right, the way that the council has agreed that we would have the planning commission take a look at it and bring it back. Okay, Mr. Womack?
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Of course, part of the reason I bring it to council, even though I strongly suspected that you would want to send it back to the planning commission, is that sometimes it's appropriate to get a feeling for what the council's eventual desire and goal would be. Because if the council's not even willing to consider anything, any type of solution, it wouldn't be appropriate to send it to the planning commission for input. So I will take this back to the planning commission. I don't expect a solution by the next meeting, but we will start working on it.
If I may, city manager,
Only been
I would like to have it seen that if they're crossing over a sidewalk to park on the grass, they become responsible for any damage that's made to the sidewalk.
Yes.
Yeah, so we actually, we installed approximately $500,000 worth of sidewalks, I believe, a year ago. And within days of that being installed, we had persons driving over the brand-new sidewalk. And we did make contact with those homeowners, and we indicated exactly that they started breaking up the brand-new concrete, that we would hold them responsible.
Absolutely. All right, moving on to B, discussion of corner lot fencing. I made my comment earlier, I think we should send it back to the planning commission, but if there's any questions or concerns, please refer your thoughts or process to the manager. Mrs. Powell, your input.
I've studied this and I don't quite understand the whole fencing issue. So I'm gonna need to study it a little bit more. But I do remember a time when somebody on the east side
Yes.
built a fence that was so high, you couldn't see over it, and it was so close to the sidewalk, you couldn't, if you were backing out of their driveway, you couldn't see if somebody was walking or going by on a bike. So that part I do understand it. You can't block people's vision from traffic, cars or pedestrians.
Mr. Gross.
Speaking from somebody who deals with this, any property owner that buys a corner parcel
Yep.
should understand that he has 2 front yards.
Yes.
Any zoning and requirements and setbacks that are set for that property applies to both front yards. They essentially have 2 front yards, 2 backyards, no side yards. Because it's pretty much a done deal that way. People will buy it and not realize that and not think about it. The visibility factor is one of those factors that has to be taken into consideration. Most every ordinance I've ever seen will dictate that no fence over 3 foot can be placed within the front of a house. And in that case, you still have to be able to see through it. And that gives you the visibility that you need. Well, a lot of them start their taller fences, 6 foot or 8 foot, whatever they're going to allow, starts equal to the setback required for the home. And I'm not sure this gentleman that was concerned is going to take care of what he wants to take care of if we set it back even with a house or with the required setback. So to try to even change our zoning because of the concern of one person, that's up to you, and I'll go along with it if you want to send it back to the Planning Commission to rewrite an ordinance for one problem. The city manager may know if there's more of these that have come up.
Well, I will tell you that there was one individual in the Prairie Run neighborhood last year who, similar problem, wanted to extend a privacy fence all the way to the sidewalk, and I did not allow that. I do know that there is at least one house in the Prairie Run neighborhood which did it anyways. Whether they got legal permission to do that or not, I mean, they couldn't have, because the law hasn't changed since 1982. But, you know, things happened before I got here. I don't know what happened. And, you know, there are several places, including on Fifth Street, where people have projected their fences into their front yards. They shouldn't have. And I understand from talking with some of these individuals that perhaps they did get permission from the city at that point in time. Again, I don't know how, because the law hasn't changed since 1982, but things happen. So, yes, I believe it is an issue for people who own corner lots, but I strongly agree with all the things that have already been said. And I don't like the idea of changing the law simply for one person. We certainly shouldn't do that. But I do think that there are other locations that this does and would affect. But I think it has to be narrowly tailored to ensure that we don't cause the problems that the rule exists in the first place to prevent, which is is why I think it's probably appropriate to give it back to the planning commission. And similarly with the lawn problem, I don't anticipate this will be a quick solve, because once a rule is kind of established and considered, we would then have to go look at a number of corner lots and see how would this change in the law affect this, you know, with how the driveway is here and whatever else. It's not going to be an easy solution.
If the spectrum of benefit is such that it makes it worth a while to do it, then I'm all for it.
Mrs. Race, I believe you're up.
I just keep hearing something.
Pam's talking.
Was Pam talking?
Pam's trying to say something, yes.
Clarify that if you have two side yards, if you have two backyards.
Absolutely.
The rest of the law is not clarified in that, which is exceedingly frustrating when you're trying to figure out how to set up the spaces. And even in one case, my neighbor across the street, at one point had two addresses, which was exceedingly problematic. She went into City Hall and had to say, you really have to pick one. You have to have one address. And then beyond that, I have one of those non-conforming lots of city minutes actually on it that we came in and probably find Ronnie Merlington's rant about it. But we have in our code some things about setbacks having to do with the 60% rule. So we need to clarify that. They actually end up in juxtaposition to each other. So there's a whole lot of that that has to be clarified, and I don't think that this person is one person. Almost every person I know on a corner lot had a problem.
Thank you. Mrs. Race, I think it's your turn.
Yeah,
Mrs. Race.
I think that we need to push it back to the planning commission.
Clarify things.
Yep, to clarify.
Mrs. Nixon.
I think you have to pick which yard is your front yard.
I agree.
I don't think that you have no side yards simply because you have a corner lot. And if that is currently how the law is written, then I think we need to revisit that. And there's reasonable restrictions on visibility that I can appreciate and for safety of the entire community. But to say you have no side yard ever, I don't think that's a thing, or at least it shouldn't be. So, Planning Commission, please sort this one.
Okay, Mr. Womack, the consensus is we'll let the Planning Commission take a look at this thing, whether they think it should be tweaked or enforced.
And I'm sure they think of that.
Yeah, and we will, accept their recommendations. And I think there's a lot of clarity that needs to come out of this. It's what's happened in the past, we can't change that. But so there's certain lots in there that may be left the way they are, but the future ones from here forward may not be allowed to put a 6-foot privacy up. So it's just good to review this thing again and get their input, and then we can decide.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
Did you have anything that you wanted to add to that? There's such a delay when I talk anyways.
There is for me too. All right, I forgot, Miss
Yeah,
Atchison.
I'm just not sure. I'm on a corner lot.
Yes,
I didn't unmute myself. I'm on a.
Pine and Fifth,
I'm sorry, there's a big delay on my thing.
everyone.
I'm on a corner lot, and I'm not sure exactly, I feel like there's no front yard. I feel like I have two sides and two backs or something, with the way my house sits. It's more like my back faces the road, and my front faces the backyard, So, it is kind of hard to figure that out.
Thank you. Mr. Womack, any of the PC take a look at it and,
It's, again, just not an easy solution.
No, it's
This is
not.
part of the problem when we allow people to deviate from zoning.
correct.
Although I suspect strongly. But this problem was created by the fact that maybe the zoning wasn't always either A, appropriately done, or B, not adhered to. You know, sometimes it's trying to fit the awkward pieces into the manual.
Well, we're playing catch up to a point, so. And then item C was added on whether we would have a Zoom meeting for the July. I guess my thought is, I don't mind it. If a council member wishes not to come to the meeting, per Mr. Womack's discussion, they would be able to speak their mind, but they wouldn't be entitled to vote. Who knows, with the rising cases of COVID-19 on the rise again, we may be in the same situation. So I don't have a problem with it. And the rest of the counselors, if you want to, Mr. Gross?
It doesn't,
Pam has a question.
Her volume is real low, we can hardly hear her.
Try to turn up my volume. Or I can speak louder.
Yes,
Does that work?
kind of.
So, I have a question. I'm a high-risk person. I can come in an N95 mask and goggles that I can obtain from my EMT. But can we be 6 feet apart?
We can't.
So, Ms. Conley, right,
Law states we still have to practice social distancing even if we're holding these meetings live.
so Ms. Conley, right now, we are mostly 6 feet apart. There's only 2 people who are within 6 feet of each other. I think we could probably accommodate that. The only issue there is gonna be how many members of the public show up. I see no reason why we couldn't make sure that you're set up in a,
Break room.
I guess, a set-aside area of the room so that you are especially distant from everybody if you so wished. But of course, the only reason I even propose this is because thankfully the city council generally agrees. We have very few votes that are 3-4, 4-3. And so I didn't see it necessarily as a problem. But of course, you know, the vote is a very important thing to council members, and I appreciate that as well. I'm just, unfortunately, I think we are all hamstrung a little bit by the governor's executive orders being in conflict with the Open Meeting Act, which is set to expire on June 30th.
Right. But my understanding is that at the expiration, the 6-foot social distancing requirement will still be in effect. Am I wrong?
No, I believe you are correct.
So,
So would we not also have to provide that for the members of our community?
Yes, so, you know, we have talked about this, and this is one of the reasons we weren't prepared to have a in-person meeting today at today's meeting. Now, we've also talked about potentially holding these meetings at the library because they have a larger community room. We've also talked about holding these at the amphitheater so that we could all be outdoors.
it works.
Part of the issue there is we just got done spending a good amount of money to be able to record these meetings for YouTube and for our own records. Now, and I know Ms. Johnson's gonna have a coronary when she hears this, I just purchased what's essentially a selfie stick for my work phone that we could then use to mount and record the meeting on the phone. I'm sure the audio wouldn't be great, but it would be a solution. So there are a number of options. Well, I'm operating under the assumption that council would want to have the meeting in the council chambers. So to, I guess, answer your question is, yes, 6-foot social distancing would be required, and we would do our best to enforce that.
Yep. We could put a table off the end that way to keep the distancing and take out chairs in the attendance portion, 6 foot and space available.
What would probably be easiest for us would be to have the Madam Mayor Pro Tem sit where Ms. Schindel-Nepper Elsky is right now,
Yes,
and where Bill LaRose normally sits.
correct.
It is furthest in the corner, it is furthest from any members of the public, and we could erect some kind of barrier if necessary. But there are options on the table, depending on how we want to proceed.
See where the chips fall come July.
Well, I can attend wearing PPE if I know I can be 6 feet apart.
There you go.
Yeah, I don't anticipate that being a problem.
Yeah, not a problem. I think everyone should wear masks anyway in the July meeting like we are now. And we'll accommodate what we need to make it happen.
Matter of fact, Mr. Hall, as you're aware, there is a door behind me at this moment in time. We
Yeah.
could send the Mayor Pro Tem out to the garage.
Or in the break room. There's the break room.
The break room would also be acceptable.
So she's in the building, so that makes it, so we have a lot of options. I think we'll make it work.
She'd have to yell her vote. I'm not sure she's capable of doing that.
Mrs. Nixon, you had a comment, I take it.
I do. So,
You're our expert, let us know
I do have the ability to bring
if you can get a word in otherwise.
okay. So the question that I have then is the individual who would need this accommodation the most because of their risk status, do you feel that you would need to attend via Zoom, which is a reasonable accommodation given your high-risk status?
If I'm not allowed to vote, then I would feel like I would have to have a
See, that's it, she would have to be here.
Okay,
We could put her in the office up front or however.
then we,
I am willing to continue to do this if I'm allowed to vote.
Yeah, see, that's
Okay.
it, that's the
Now,
kicker.
of course, the problem for me is I don't care. I think it's an acceptable solution to have the Mayor Pro Tem sit in another room here in City Hall. We're all aware she's here.
Yep.
We could hear her, we could see her if we peek around a corner. That's acceptable to me.
She could,
But I don't know what the Open Meetings Act would say about that. And I don't know if there's somebody who would complain about that. So I am trying my best to ensure that what we do is 100% legal, not 99% legal.
I think, Mrs. Johnson, could you check into that if we have to be in the same room to vote? Or could we be in separate rooms and still be counted as a vote in the Open Meetings Act?
I have a proposed solution.
I think we should listen to the nurse.
Yep,
Molly Nixon, you're muted.
Mrs. Nixon, go ahead.
So here's my proposed solution. Many of the hardware stores recently had that plastic that you put over your windows in the winter for really cheap. I think we could make you your little isolation tent.
Yep.
We could, if we put it in front of one of the doors, have fans behind you so it's a positive pressure tent so it would blow whatever out. And then you would be in the room on video, but still in your own little isolation.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm even willing to be 6 feet apart, as long as I get the appropriate PPE, which I will. But I need to be 6 feet apart.
Okay.
Sounds good. We'll come up with something by then, for sure. Mrs. John?
I need to be closer if you want me in plastic bubble.
Mrs. Johnson?
Mr. Hall, that's probably more of an appropriate question for myself and the city attorney.
Okay, that's fine. I'll ask Mr. Womack about if a council person has to be present in the meeting, or can that person be in another room but still in the same building and still cover ourselves for the Open Meetings Act. So we'll, future announcements on that. Any other?
You know, there's probably people on planning commission and on DDA, and.
We can find out, you know, with all meetings.
Similar issues.
Yep. Any other discussions on the July meeting before we move to communications?
So, I guess similarly related to the question, I would indicate that oftentimes times at the end of June. We do have to wrap up some, issues because of course the
End of the year.
ends on June 30. I don't want to set a meeting at this time, but I would ask that you guys look at your calendars, see what dates could or could not work for you for that possibility if necessary. And of course, the virtual meetings run through June 30, so you could do a meeting virtually if necessary. And I don't anticipate anything occurring between now and then, but I just ask you to look at your calendars.
In other words, we could call a special meeting to clear up any additional for the budget, is what you're saying?
If necessary, yes, thank you.
Okay. We'll, we will consider maybe calling a special meeting for any budget amendments we would need to do before the end of June, and we can all do it during Zoom. So we'll let the, we don't have them until our finance director puts them out what we need to amend, and we'll know more towards the end of the month. Any other questions or concerns before we move to communications? Hearing none. Mr. Womack's community event calendar.
Yeah, I have nothing to add regarding communications.
Everyone has looked over our communications. Any questions of any of those? Hearing none, moving on to departmental reports. Mr. Womack's.
Well,
We're getting there.
now that I'm unmuted. So as council members are aware, staff has been working full-time since this all started. We are all essential workers down here at City Hall. Some staff people have worked remotely. A lot of staff have come into the office and simply worn masks and socially distanced, washed their hands. And so City Hall will be opening on Monday to the general public. Of course, we will ask members of the general public to avoid coming to City Hall if they could possibly do what they need to do by email or phone, just like they have for the last couple of months. We'd ask that people continue to use the payment drop boxes as they have for the last couple of months. And we're hoping that we're able to have a smooth transition. Now, for members of the public who've not been into City Hall, obviously recently we did erect a sneeze shield, and staff has some rules that will be applied to them regarding wearing masks and washing hands, et cetera, et cetera. We have been very, very fortunate thus far that no staff member has contracted COVID-19, at least not that we're aware of. And I'm thankful to have my council members all still be very healthy. And so this is an ongoing thing. It didn't stop just because the stay-at-home order stopped. And people are still going to get COVID-19. People are still going to get sick. People are still going to die. But I understand that the economy does have to rebound at some point. So I guess I'll leave it at that. City Hall will reopen on Monday the 15th.
Thank you. Department reports. Department of Public Works. We don't have a representative here tonight. Mr. LaRose is out.
So, again, as council's aware, Mr. LaRose was here present.
Yes.
But we lost power at the very beginning of the meeting. And his place when we lose power is to ensure that the water infrastructure is running appropriately. So I believe he is at one of the well houses at this moment in time.
For the council's input, currently the well, or the water tower is drained and being inspected and disinfected, and it's filling, and it currently has to set for 3 days. And he has to take back T samples for each 3 days before he can put it into service. So we're running on one of the wells that's constantly running with pressure relief valves to maintain pressure throughout the city during this time. So it's very nerve-wracking. I can remember them days vividly. Thank you. Any questions of the Department of Public Works? Police Department, I see Mr. Todd is on the phone. Any questions of the police department? Hearing none, and then our fire chief, Chief Frazier.
I don't have anything unless the council has questions. They're making a mud wrestling pit over there in Second now with the rain and dirt.
Yes, indeed.
But they did get started.
They have started.
We have a contract signed with Orion now.
We don't. We are negotiating on a couple of the minor parts. I believe we've come to a meeting of the minds. We simply haven't signed the document at this point.
In other words, all the work they're done now is free.
Sure.
All right.
All right, City Clerk, Ms. Johnson, do you have any questions or concerns? Her smile says no. Any questions of the clerk? And then,
Just to let everybody know that, I do have an expected delivery date for my baby. Expected delivery is the week of July 13th.
oh,
See you at the next meeting, but if possible, I may have baby early. But we are having a baby girl.
okay, we can have Chief Frazier and the fire department stand by here. You can be at the meeting.
We just got new carpet.
All right, having said that, Mrs. Falcon, any questions of her? I think if you have any concerns where we need to do some budget amendments before June 30th, we can call a special meeting and get that taken care of. That'll lighten up the July meeting. Because it has to be done before July 1. Anyone have any questions of our finance director and treasurer?
Mr. Hall, I'd only point out that Ms. Falcon did inherit a budget and some budget documents that weren't always in the greatest of order.
Yes.
And she does continuously work to make sure that they are following all the GASB rules and ensuring that we're able to pay our bills and bring in the money that we need to pay those bills.
Absolutely.
So I thank her for her work, and we did have a tough year this year with COVID-19, trying to budget for some of that stuff. We had a very light winter, which screwed up our road funding and how we dispersed the road funding. And as council should be aware, with the 2 months of quarantine that we just went through, every city in the state of Michigan is anticipating having a severe reduction in state revenue sharing next year.
Absolutely.
Which is our second largest source of revenue.
Yes.
So we may be in for some austerity in the future. So I will blame Ms. Falcon at that point for that.
I'm sure she will do it just fine. Any questions of Ms. Falcon? Do you have any questions of us, Ms. Falcon? Thank you. Moving on then to code enforcement. Any questions or concerns? And then the building inspector. I'm still waiting on mine. I can't get that inspected because Mr. Womack will not issue me a pot grower's license in there so I could get it finished. It would be an essential business then, but it's not.
Rude.
We also prohibit marijuana businesses from being located next to a single-family residence.
In the corner lot. Thank you. Boards
But
and
you are
commissions.
capable of growing your own.
Yeah, I was gonna do my own, at least put a couple in there of him. He won't let me. Boards and commissions. We're at item 11 at this evening. Council comments. Mr. Gross?
I rest. I made a lot of comments tonight. That's probably enough.
Mrs. Reyes?
Well, I'm excited about the decisions that were made tonight. We've worked very hard and for a very long time to think about every person that lives in the city and what's best for them. I was at the groundbreaking ceremony for the fire station, which was pretty cool. And just trying to figure out how the new world is gonna come about with everything. Working from home for months, but still being able to communicate with everyone has been great. It's nice to be here, to see everyone's faces, especially Rose, of course. But thank you for all of your work, Mr. City Manager, on this marijuana stuff too. So, thank you. All I got.
Thank you. Mrs. Nixon, this is glad to have you back,
It's good to be back.
I'm sure.
Mrs. Connolly, I will be building you a bubble, and I look forward to seeing you too. It was good to be here, and similar to Mr. Gross, I think I've said enough for all of us.
Mrs. Atchison, I haven't forgotten you.
Just kind of piggyback on what Renee said, thanks everybody for everything that's going on. I think that we're moving forward, still moving forward. The hotel is looking lovely, I drive by it all the time. It's really looking like it's getting there. I think the outside's pretty much done. And they're working on the rest of it, so that's exciting. And everything else that's happening. That's it.
Thank you. Mrs. Powell.
Just a little comment on the community garden down by the post office. The garden club, we're geared it up, we've been starting to plant again, and we certainly hope everybody enjoys it this year. Again, it's just a lot of fun, and people just love it. They stop and they talk and they go on and on about how beautiful it is, and it makes me very proud of our city. So, I guess I'm glad to see everybody, and thank you for all the hard work. And that's it.
Thank you. Mrs. Conley. Mrs. Conley, you have a comment closing?
Did we lose her?
I don't hear her or see her.
Where is she?
Now she does, just gotta give her a minute.
Okay, we don't hear you.
Here she goes.
Still don't hear
Now I
you.
hear you, but it's real low.
You're real low, your volume.
There, I think
Well,
we're
I
good.
will speak really loudly.
Okay.
I was just saying thank you for accommodating my high-risk status and understanding that. And at the same time, making sure business goes on. I was very excited we could have the groundbreaking for the fire station. And we were able to practice social distancing, and all of the folks there had masks on, which was wonderful. And I hope that we can continue to keep doing the city's business while keeping people safe. Because, as Mr. Womack said, we are not done with this.
No. Thank you. Well, my comment is, you know, we've came a long way here probably in the last 3 months with our Zoom meetings and social distancing, and it's working. I think we need to continue to do that. We've had some very good constructive meetings, and things are moving along smoothly. The groundbreaking for the fire station is very good, and I'm glad to see we're moving on that. But, you know, we want to be very mindful. That's our biggest expenditure we're going to have for a long time, and so it'll be a great building. And I thank every one of the staff for all the work they've put in to continually, we're here. The city is open and providing services. And thank you for the council and the planning commission for all your people and your input and your hard work to make sure the city is as wonderful it is. At that note, is there any other business to be brought before this council?
Not at this time.
Not at this time. The meeting stands adjourned at 8:56. Thank you one and all. Be safe and keep up the social distancing and your masks. I'm old. I'm the one that's most susceptible. Maybe. too ornery, my wife says.